anything that young people, especially young women, do online is seen as like at the best shallow and stupid, and at the worst like deeply harmful.
There is a moral panic happening right now when it comes to kids and technology. Alice Marwick is one of the foremost researchers on this topic. She studied it for decades, and she, along with a bunch of other researchers, just released this fantastic 82-page report breaking down the state of child online safety laws. Alice and I are going to debunk some of the most pervasive fear-mongering narratives that you might have heard about kids and social media, and we're going to dive deep into what the research actually says and how we can actually help kids have a healthy and productive relationship with the media and technology of their time. So you worked with a bunch of other researchers on this big report that just came out. Can you tell me a little bit about how this report came together and kind of what you guys hope to achieve with it?
I spend a lot of time in, tech policy circles. What we saw was these really prevalent moral panic rhetorics around young people and social media, and very little discussion of where these rhetorics came from or why this was hitting so hard right now. And so what I wanted to do was get together with some other tech policy researchers and really take a look at this landscape, but also delve into the research from a variety of disciplines that sort of underpins the assumption that is justifying this and other kids' online safety bills.
Yeah, it seems like the only thing that Congress can agree on lately is that cell phones and social media are just destroying young people's lives. Where do you think this panic originated?
Well, I've seen a moral panic around kids in tech several times. I think that what happened this time was that the pandemic happened, and I think that drew greater attention to the fact that a lot of kids are really struggling with mental health right now. How do we solve this problem? By banning certain kinds of technology. What's the problem? It's kids using technology. Who's public enemy number one? The tech industry. I believe in tech regulation. I'm not like a huge fan of social platforms or the tech industry, but I also think that if you're going to institute tech regulation, it has to be well thought out, because poor regulation can have so many unintended consequences.
So when we look at a bunch of these moral panics past that you mentioned, a lot of people will say, well, this time is different. Well, and a lot of parents, I mean, you can show them all the data you want. They see every day that they struggle to get their kids off the phones, or their kids seem more depressed. So how do you know that this time isn't different?
I think what's most striking is that there's this really big difference between what academic research tells us and what popular consensus is. If you look at the studies around youth mental health, there is really, really vague relationships between social media, cell phone, or even internet use in general and youth mental health. The relationships are not at all causal, but I think people like narratives that tie into their pre-existing beliefs. And the kids are not all right is sort of an evergreen narrative. Being suspicious of young people's use of technology is an evergreen narrative dating all the way back to Plato and Socrates being suspicious of kids learning to write. And I think that there is something visceral about watching your kid just like scrolling through a screen that does make you have this sense of like, oh my God, am I being a bad parent by letting them have screen time? If it's the screen's fault, then all I have to do is ban the screens and then my kids will be okay. I wish it was that simple, but unfortunately, I think it's more complicated than that.
A lot of times when we talk about research, and I was watching a clip of one of those morning shows recently where they're talking about, how all of the researchers are saying XYZ. When you dig in, they seem to be really citing two main researchers, and you mentioned them in the report. It's this man, Jonathan Haidt, and this woman, Jean Twenge. Can you talk to me a little bit about who these people are and what they are purporting?
So they're both psychologists. Jonathan Haidt is a moral psychologist who doesn't study youth. He doesn't study technology. And Jean Twenge does study youth and technology, and she studied youth and technology for a really long time. So I first started studying Jean Twenge 2010s, where she was writing all these books about how millennials were really narcissistic because they took a lot of selfies. And that was sort of like her drumbeat at the time. And because I was doing research with teenagers around the United States at that point, like I was going to all these small towns in the South and like interviewing young people about their MySpace practices and their Facebook practices, I knew that I didn't see any evidence of the things that she was talking about. And so I already sort of had like pricked up my ears. And what I find about Twenge is that she has this sense of pathology. There's something wrong with young people. But what it is that's wrong with them changes from book to book. And what it is that causes that pathology also changes from book to book. Jonathan Haidt has also been, his first book about young people talked about like helicopter parenting and how young people should be allowed more freedom and independence, which is something that I actually agree with. But then this new book, The Anxious Generation, talks specifically about how young people are anxious and worried and depressed because of social media and cell phones, which would seem to me to contradict his earlier work. But what you find about both of them is they love to tell these like big stories that are really simplistic, and they really call for heavy, heavy regulation of the tech industry in ways that I don't even think are really realistic. Like, I think both of them would like to get rid of cell phones and social media altogether. And whether or not you think that's a good idea, it's not really a solution that we can propose as a viable one.
I think another commonality between these two is that they are just so good at getting media attention and kind of flattening this narrative. Why do you think these narratives play so well in the media? And what context do you think that we're missing when we are bombarded with takes by these two?
The media loves fear-based narratives. They reinforce parents' fears, and they reinforce the sense that the tech industry is bad, that youth are vulnerable, and that we need to protect them. Now, I do think the tech industry is not great, right? There's many things the tech industry has to answer for. And my biggest fear in writing this report was that I would come off like a shill for Facebook or an apologist for the tech industry, which I am not. But I think that the narratives that feed into the tech lash, especially ones that repeat these moral panics, that pathologize youth, and that, make parents feel like, oh my God, will someone think of the children? There's a reason why these rhetorics repeat every few years. It's because they're powerful, because they play into people's deepest fears. And by parroting exactly what the media wants to hear, I think hate and twenge have really been able to amplify their own ideas while disregarding a lot of the nuance that's actually going on in the field.
A lot of their defenders will say, well, what's the harm? Oh, he's got this 4-point plan. What's the problem with keeping kids off their phone until they're 16 or 18 or banning them from social media to err on the side of safety?
Well, I think there's two things. The first is that if we assume technology is the cause of mental health issues, then by banning technology or by changing technology, there's an assumption that we're going to solve mental health issues. This doesn't look at any of the sort of alternate explanations for the mental health crisis, and it doesn't address any of the sort of deeper underlying emotional issues that young people might be grappling with. We know that young people grapple with anxiety around climate, gun violence, poverty, reproductive rights, partisanship. There's so many studies that show that all of these things affect mental health, just like they do adult mental health, right? I mean, teenagers and adults are not like hugely materially different when it comes to this type of thing. So I worry that by focusing on technology, we're overlooking broader solutions that might better address young people's mental health. And the second problem is that what hate and twenge are doing is they're playing into this rhetoric that's being used to justify pretty intense legislation that I think will have very harmful effects. This rhetoric really says, parents should have full control over what their kids are exposed to, that the government should step in to prevent young people from seeing information their parents don't want them to see. And, even though COSA is milder than some of the similar state bills, they're sort of all built upon this rhetoric of parental rights that I think knowingly or unknowingly twenge and hate are fueling.
You also mentioned sexual exploitation and abuse, and you hear a lot of this as a fear among parents. Can you talk a little bit about the research and what you found in relation to that?
Yeah, so there's this myth that young people go online and these sort of adult pedophiles prey on them. And the worst case scenario is, they abduct them. And this fear of the online predator has been around for about 20 years now. And it's just simply not based on evidence. That's not to say this never happens, but it's like spending all your time worrying about being struck by lightning or being bitten by a shark. In general, when you look at young people who have experienced unwanted sexual attention online, it's usually coming from a peer. And when you look at things like, non-consensual sexual imagery, what's popularly called revenge porn or sextortion, often that resembles the dynamics of intimate partner violence more than it does like stranger danger. There's this sort of sense that if you can just prevent people from contacting young people online, then you're going to be able to prevent all these negative effects, which isn't true if they're coming from peers, right? But the mechanisms by which legislation like COSA purports to solve this is really unclear. We sort of read through all these bills like line by line, and the line that stood out to us was the sort of regulation on who can contact youth online. So if you're on, TikTok or Facebook or whatever, and you are under 18, then nobody can contact you except people in your network, people you're already friends with. It's really unclear how this is going to work. And I don't see how that in any way is going to decrease these sort of like ostensible negative effects. Like it's not going to have an impact on sextortion or revenge porn if these things are mostly being done by people's peers. And I think what it will do is prevent young people from meeting people online, including, other kids, adults, teenagers who maybe share their common interests or can be sources of material support. And when you look at what kids like about the internet, especially kids who are maybe marginalized or minoritized or kids who have like weird, niche, nerdy interests, a lot of what they like about the internet is that it allows them to find other people with those interests who are experiencing the same things as them. But if you cut down their communication practices to only a handful of people, which again, the bill is really vague about how this would work, then that cuts off that source of social support. And I don't think it's really going to do much to improve, the statistics around sexual assault or victimhood.
Another thing social media is sort of constantly blamed for are eating disorders and self-harm. And you hear Haidt especially talking about this constantly. What did you find when you were looking into these topics?
This is a really interesting research area because what people find is that the content that can reinforce people's disordered eating is not just pro Anna or pro Mia content. Instead, it's like people will follow Fitspo accounts or they will just look at selfies in the same way that in the 1990s, people would look at beauty magazines or fashion magazines, right? Now, how on earth do you legislate against it? These are serious social issues that you can't legislate away by putting regulations on social platforms.
Yeah, it seems like these are broader societal issues.
Yeah.
I mean, that we need to shift our notions as well of like what looks like a, idealized body and all of that. I mean, I'm a millennial, so I grew up as a kid in the aughts, when I think there was just horrible. I mean,
the
women's
Paris Hilton, Nicole Richie, like low-rise jeans, like the whole shebang.
yeah, and women's media did not show a diversity of bodies the way that, you can find on the internet now.
I think one of the most positive developments in young people's self-image has been movement towards body positivity and body diversity. That kind of stuff happened because of the internet. It happened because of young people's activism on platforms like Instagram. If you cut off young people from participating in those platforms, what you do is you cut down on that amount of social activism and social change.
Another big thing that, social media is constantly critiqued for is this concept of addiction. What did you find when you looked into this? How real is this concept of social media addiction?
So in general, there's this idea that social media is addictive because it produces like hits of dopamine that your feed is constantly scrolling, you're getting new content all the time and you get addicted to it. No researcher will tell you this is how the brain interacting with technology works. The research that we have shows that a small minority of people, and thus a small minority of young people, do exhibit sort of compulsive behaviors towards social media or their phones in the same way that people exhibit compulsive behaviors towards video games or shopping or gambling or sex or TV or Netflix or a large variety of other things, right? But most of the studies on this are either on internet use generally or on social platforms generally. And none of them delve down into the level of like a feature. So some of these bills, for example, New York has the SAFE Act, which is Stop Addictive Feeds Exploitation. And what that bill says is that users have to have the ability to turn on a chronological feed. Great. I have no problem with that. Every Instagram user I know has been asking for a chronological feed since the platform got rid of it, right? Like giving people more options is always great. But I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that giving people the option to have a chronological feed will decrease their use of their devices or will improve their behavior in some way. It's just simply not there, right? If you're going to propose a solution, there has to be a link between a solution and the decrease of the behavior that you're trying to stop. And there just isn't any.
Okay, so I want to run through just some of these proposed solutions to this alleged social media crisis. The first is age verification. This is this broader push to up the age of social media. There's all these tools now that can theoretically detect how old you are, I guess, from scanning your face. What are some of the problems with age verification and age gating content online?
Anytime I talk to people who support these laws, they always say they don't require age verification. And I just don't buy that. If there's laws that make platforms liable for content that is shown to minors, then the platforms are going to have to make extremely sure that they're not showing that content to minors. That means that it's not about proving that you're under 18 because everyone will be assumed to be under 18. It's about proving that you're over 18. The only way you can prove if you're over 18 is the first is that you show some sort of identity document like a driver's license or a passport. right? You're uploading this to some sort of nebulous third-party age verification software. We don't have any idea what software is going to be used. We don't know what the privacy, implications are. I think most people would find it problematic if they went to like Wikipedia, for example, and if they wanted to view a page about like an LGBTQ topic, all of a sudden they had to upload their driver's license. Like that is just a bad vibe in general. And what it's doing is it's regulating First Amendment protected content on like a very broad level. The second thing is there are these AI systems that claim to purport to know how old you are. If you've ever played with one of those filters on Instagram or TikTok that tells you how old you are, they are not accurate in any way. And so I really worry about these types of age verification because not only do they discriminate against people who don't have identification, like undocumented immigrants, people who are poor, the unhoused, like there's lots of Americans who don't have a credit card or a driver's license. And so you're basically cutting them off from most of the internet. But it also means that there is going to be a record of you tied to your real world identity and the sites that you visit as you go around the internet. And this is about the most privacy violating behavior I can imagine online.
A lot of this legislation comes with basically provisions for parental controls and this idea that why don't we give parents more control over their kids' online experience? Why is that a bad thing?
So I think there's a big difference between like parental controls for kids like under 13 and parental controls for kids over 13, and especially parental control for kids like 16, 17, 18. What we're seeing is that there are states like Arkansas, Indiana, Iowa, Tennessee, and Wisconsin that want to make social posts, messages, and likes available to parents. So if you're a parent, you can go on Instagram or TikTok and see every video, every post that your kid has seen, and everything that they've liked. Now, it's important for parents to be able to, a certain extent, to keep their kids safe online. But what this does is it completely diminishes kids from having any kind of privacy on the internet other than their parents, right? Now, in most cases, if you have parents who are good and loving and more or less agree with what their kids are doing online, this probably isn't going to be a problem. But when we get to sort of minoritized and marginalized kids, then it becomes a big problem. Because what we see with similar rhetoric is that parents really want to limit kids' access to LGBTQ content, especially content about trans and gender diversity. Parents want to limit their kids from having access to information about racial diversity, from, the panic over critical race theory, over DEI. This is all the same thing. So you have this group of parents who think they should have full control over everything their kids are exposed to. And they want to make sure that their kids are not getting exposed to woke ideas online. What this does is it makes it very likely that a lot of these bills are going to be used to shut down this type of content specifically. It means that a kid who wants to maybe explore LGBTQ issues or just learn about them, a kid who might want to access information about reproductive health or sexuality, a kid who wants to learn about political beliefs or religious beliefs that are different from those their parents, they wouldn't be able to use the internet to do any of those things. And I think that's specifically by design. I think that is what these bills want parents to be able to do. Whether or not you think that's a good thing is going to depend on your own view of parenting, right? Is it about controlling your kids, or is it about sort of facilitating your kids growing into sort of full-fledged adults? And that's a really big difference between conservative and liberal parenting styles.
You heard this rhetoric directly from people like Jonathan Haidt and Marsha Blackburn, who said that social media was indoctrinating, kids into the transgender ideology. And Jonathan Haidt saying that gender dysphoria is essentially contagiously affecting, girls online. It seems like there's just this fundamentally really regressive political movement behind and underneath all of this. Why do you think it's received so much bipartisan support and so much support from liberal, sort of progressive parents?
I think most people just don't know about this element of it. I think that all parents want to keep their kids safe. I think we all know that there's lots of disgusting stuff on the internet that we don't want to be exposed to, let alone our kids exposed to. I think that a lot of the people who support this legislation are really well-meaning, and I think there's a really strong social impetus to try to hold the tech industry accountable for their various nefarious deeds. For better or for worse, mostly for worse, this seems to be the only type of tech regulation that people can get on board with. I have high hopes for the American Privacy Rights Act, but we haven't been able to pass any comprehensive privacy legislation yet. We haven't even been able to regulate companies like data brokers, which is sort of the lowest hanging fruit of tech regulation.
Can you talk a little bit about this duty of care provision and kind of what this means. You hear this phrase a lot, and I'm not sure everybody totally knows what it means or the implications.
Duty of care is something really interesting about COSA. It basically says that platforms have a duty of care to their minor users. In other words, they have the duty to make sure that those children are not harmed. And that's similar to like, schools have a duty of care when kids are there or something like that. Now, that's all well and good, but it means that social media companies have to determine what kind of content is harmful to young people. That's impossible to determine, right? I can view a piece of content, another person can view the same piece of content, and it can have completely different effects on us. And what's probably going to happen is there's going to be a sort of an overcorrection or over moderation where large swaths of content that is legal under the First Amendment and is probably not harmful to most people is going to be removed on the risk that it's harmful. The way COSA has been changed is that the FTC would be responsible for determining what content is harmful. Now, do we really want the government determining what content is good and bad for our children to see? Parents make really different decisions about the type of content that their kids should be exposed to. Look at the Fur Over Drag Queen Story Hour, right? Which a lot of parents think is a great experience for their kids to be exposed to. And there's other parents who think that it's like the worst thing ever. So I think the idea that you can easily categorize content as harmful or not harmful, and that platforms are legally liable for that kind of harmful content, it's just totally misguided. It doesn't resemble reality in the way we interact with content online.
What are some things that you recommend we all do in terms of society and just on an individual level to fight this moral panic?
The first thing is that we really need to center young people. We need to talk to young people about what it is that they want and the problems they're having, what is causing any kind of problematic relationship with media, and also what is causing mental health issues. Think studies that sort of center the experiences of young people, not just young people who are on these like nonprofits or like, the top of the class. We need to talk to the kids, a really diverse group of kids from all around the country. Centering their concerns is really important. The second thing is that we need increased access for mental health care for literally everybody. It's so hard to get mental health care nowadays. There's an enormous shortage of therapists. There's enormous waiting lists. People are uninsured. They can't afford it. This needs to change. And then I think that there are sort of some areas of this legislation that we can learn from. I think everyone should have more control over promoted content, over advertisements. And finally, we really need to pass federal privacy legislation because there are so many harms of social media that are really being caused by the fact that social platform companies and advertisers have virtually unlimited access to what we do online. It's not like that in any other form of interpersonal communication media, and that really needs to change.
Is there anything else you think we can do to just change this public narrative about social media? How can those who care about these issues, including young people, fight back?
Narratives hook into public discourse because they are more fun or interesting or sensational or fear-based than the actual situation, which is we've just gotten through a COVID pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. There's widespread, fears of climate change. There's not enough mental health. Like that is a lot less sexy of a narrative than social media is rotting kids' brains and we need to ban it because Mark Zuckerberg and TikTok are evil. The problem is I find that the researchers who do the best work on this, the skill set that's required to do really good research is not always the skill set that's required to like get a Netflix special or do a TED Talk. Once one of these narratives takes root, it's really hard to get rid of it.
Well, thank you so much for chatting. Where can people continue to follow your work?
Yeah, so my website is tiara.org, TIARA.org, like a crown. And on pretty much all social media, I'm at Alice Tiara.
Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and listen to my podcast, Power User, wherever you get podcasts, where we're breaking down all of these issues and more.